my previous video showed how to just install a Bootstrap UI plugin and then get it running to make use of the Bootstrap 5 front-end framework. And we created a form using just typing everything in. But now we're going to look at baking our templates based on Bootstrap UI templates, and then look at a few ways of extending things so that we have a greater control over our helpers and things like that. So to begin, to do a bake, we need some database tables. So what I've done is, just in my app local, I've given myself a SQLite database here, running bin cake migrations and just status. What that does is create a migrations folder, and then the default database is now available here. To speed things along, in the cake migrations documentation, we can create a complete migration on the command line, and I'm just going to copy in some code that I've created earlier just to show you. So create a new text file here so you can see it. But this is going to create a post table with a title and body fields, one being string and the other being text, and then the default timestamp fields. This next one's going to create a users table with email as a string and name fields as a string, and created and modified again. And then finally we've got an add a column to the previous post table using an add migration or a change migration here. Notice this sleep one between each one of these commands. I'll just run the commands and then show you why that is. So we've pasted it in, and we create 3 migrations. As you can see, the migrations have been created under the config migrations folder. Now create post migration, it just does all the work for you. You don't have to type anything in. Same again for create users, and then we've got an add column instead of a create statement. So you can see at the end here, these original migrations are creating tables. This one's doing an add column and an update. To get that running, we can just look at our status. The migrations are currently down. Run migrate, and that now has created the tables in the database. So why did we run sleep commands between each one of those command line arguments? Notice that the migrations are tagged, and if we have a look at the status again, their IDs wouldn't be unique if we ran them straight after one after the other. It'd all be on the same second, and then they would be in conflict with each other. So adding sleep between running those 3 things just stops that conflict. That's not a big issue if you're running things one at a time. So now let's look at running our baking of templates. So, oops, I didn't copy that right. Let's go back. And here we see that we've got different options. We could bake model, views, controllers, templates, all that sort of stuff, but we can bake all just by saying all, and we want to create everything, all the scaffolding, and then we say users, and that's now created all our controllers, our table classes, our entity classes, and then if we have a look in templates, it's created our templates and views there as well. So looking at that, we can enter users and create a new user. Obviously this is really just auto-complete to create a user and create a new post, title, test, body test, and it's just selecting the only possible user. So now we've got just to change a few things with regard to links. We can go into our templates and just add a link to our previous, because it's not linked by anything other than, so we can just say controller, and we want to link to our forms controller that contains our print action. And we can add that into our sidebar on both of these things, and then we can do something similar. Let's go back in here. So we've got put list users in our print actions here, so we can pop this in and go into here and just copy across our list post action. And get rid of our bogus link there that doesn't do anything. So now we've got links to back and forwards to our different areas, and that's really all that's required to create Bootstrap enabled views. Really quick and simple. But another thing that we can do, if we have a look at the documentation and we keep going down, there's a bunch of helpers, and then there's a bunch of information about creating different types of controls. But just an example of one that's really quite useful in our print form. Just close these others. We can do things such as and this is creating an input group, but it's really quite simple. So we can use append or prepend. Let's do both to show the example. So prepend is the start of the form, and if we then refresh, we can see that it's able to do that. You can then include multiples, and obviously this is just an example, but you can do multiples here, and it really makes it quite simple. Another thing you can do as well, if you want to use the Bootstrap classes that works with icons, so we can do prepend and just pop our printer icon in there, and that's another way of really improving the visual hinting for form fields. Okay, so now we might have another challenge that we'll find when we start to use this really good plugin, and that is when we look into vendor, friends of cake, go down to SRC, go into our view and into our helper folder. These are all the helpers that are providing our form controls, our HTML, and as you can see, we just used an icon class, and it's in the HTML helper here. But we never want to add anything into the vendor directory because it'll ruin upgrades. So how do we go about making this sort of overridable? Well, the UI view trait specifies when Bootstrap plugin loads this loads itself, it overrides all these particular helpers with its thing. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to grab the UI view trait and copy that into our src view directory. Just minimize all this stuff so that it's not quite so stretched out. So go into here and paste it in. Now, to use this, we need to change its namespace to the correct namespace, AppView. And we also need to go into our AppView folder. At the moment, it is extending UI view, and all UI view is doing is extending CakePHP and then including the UI view trait. So we're going to do the same thing in AppView now, except we're going to use our UI view trait. So now going back to here, we're no longer going to extend UI view. We're going to extend CakePHP, so we can get rid of this. And then we need to use our version of the UI view trait. So you can see that that's that top one, the AppView UI view trait. And if we have a look at the UI view trait in the Bootstrap plugin area, we can see that we can pass an array of options in and say, okay, let's override the layout when we initialize things. So we can do that in AppView here. So instead of doing this, we can say this initialize and its UI, and then give it an option of passing in a layout. So instead of manually overriding the layout like we were doing, we can do that here. Now, because we've started to use our own UI view trait, which is right next to our AppView file, we can now come in here and override things as we need to, because it's now in our area where we can make changes. So to do that, let's bake a helper, and we're going to call it the HTML helper, and that will create a helper in our src view helper directory. And we're going to, instead of using CakeView and extending the cake helper, so we're going to get rid of this and go use Bootstrap UI, and we're going to extend the HTML helper. And because it's named the same as our helper, we need to give it an alias, Bootstrap UI, we call it helper, and we now have to just make sure it compiles properly, and we've now extended the Bootstrap UI helper, and now we can specify that instead of using the Bootstrap UI helper, we're going to use our extended one. So go HTML helper and choose the one that you've just created, and then specify it like that, and you can see that it's using the correct helper there. Now, what does that allow us to do? Well, it allows us to go in and add our own methods if we want them. Before we do that, let's test it, and we've got an error, and that error, if we have a look at the moment, we've got this, it's just the default baked helper, and we've got this default config. But if we go into our Bootstrap UI HTML helper, we'll notice that default config is being populated with everything, so we're actually causing an issue there with that. So we just need to come into our helper here, and then let's remove this so it's picking up the parent class's config, and then it should be fine. So what can we do with this extended helper? Well, one thing you might have in your database, which is kind of common, is an active column. And then you want to display that active column in your index page as a tick or a cross if it's active. So instead of yes or no or whatever you want to do. So you can say, all right, so if it's active, I want to display a check icon, and if it's inactive, I want to make a cross icon. And then from here, we want to specify that that's the icon. Now notice here that it also has the ability to pass through options, so we might make this also pass through options and defaults if they're none. Alright, so that is a small extension to our HTML helper. Now what we can do is go and use it somewhere, and we're just going to do something a little bit, just close the other ones. I'm going to do something a little bit sort of for demonstration purposes only. And here, let's just add something into our sidebar here. So create a div, be a row, and inside that row is a column, and inside that column we want a paragraph mark and 2 of them, and see how it goes when we press enter. That's good. Now what we're now going to do is, using our HTML helper, we are going to say, I'll just do one at the moment. So, and now let's have a look at our print form here, and it's saying HTML active icon does not exist in that helper. So clearly we haven't completed something. So let's go and check to see what's wrong. So we've got our app view here. We've got initialize the UI. Let's go across there and see what's happened. Let's see what our HTML helper is. And active icon. Alright, did we type in? We didn't. Alright, so we just got the name wrong there. So let's have a look at now. And we can see that we've got a little cross on there. Might be worth just putting in a little bit of margin start 3, and to bring it sort of closer to the lining up with the others. Now that works really quite well, but one thing with our editor we've noticed is that this, when I hover across it, it's saying that what the editor is seeing, it's still looking at the old CakePHP helper and not the Bootstrap helper. So we need to be able to let our editor know that we're no longer extending off view. So in our view class, we can see that we've got all these type hints here that we can use to we can override them in AppView. Now just a word of advice, I copied and pasted them in above my class here, and sorry, I copied them here, right here, and these properties overrides didn't take effect. They won't take effect unless you put them here, which is the one just before the class definition. So what I do here is I just copy these in, and then I have a look at my UI view trait and just try a memory exercise and go HTML form, flash, paginator, and breadcrumbs. So it's breadcrumbs, flash, form, HTML, paginator. Breadcrumb, flash, form, HTML, paginator. Alright, so breadcrumbs, flash, form, HTML, paginator. So we don't have that, and we don't have these ones. So now what we need to do is, instead of having these, we would choose to change them to Bootstrap UI, and we're looking for Bootstrap UI, and we're looking for the breadcrumbs helper there. But we don't need to do that. We can just copy this and replace them all with the Bootstrap UI helper, so we get all the auto completion. Now the one we've overridden, we just need to change that individual one to, if we remember, it's AppView helper instead of the Bootstrap one, and then we can just change this. Now let's go back and see if we've got auto completion working for our second option for our help here, the active icon method. Let's go to HTML and let's see if it auto completes. It does. So now we can just say true to that one, and we've now created a helper method. Now in my last video I explained that the reason why we're getting flashing with our icons is using the embedded Cake server is it seems to download the icon file every single time, and normally that would never happen. So you'll see this when we reload the page, that all the icons disappear and then reappear, but on a normal web server that says to the client browser cache this, it would just load it from the cache and you wouldn't see those flashes. Okay, so that is extending a helper to make it customizable for yourself, and then getting control of the helper classes and how they're loaded, including initializing the view with your own custom layout as well. So I hope that video is going to be helpful for someone.